Okay, I'll project.
Yes, well done.
I will project. How about that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think try the microphone first. Hearing aids and here.
Maybe if we turn it down. Yeah.
Just move it away from the speaker a little bit.
Okay, how are we doing with that? Great, okay. So, being recorded here as well. Fantastic. First of all, I want to say thank you to Jenny and the Justice and Peace Commission for the invitation to come and speak this afternoon, and also for marking Peace Sunday in this way. And thank you as well to Archbishop Malcolm for Mass this morning, and also for all your support in promoting Peace Sunday this year. So, as Jenny said, I'm Andrew Jackson, and I'm the I wanted to say I'm the current Chief Executive of Pax Christi England and Wales, but that always implies that there's somebody else coming, which I don't think there is, but who knows. And we're a section of Pax Christi International, the Catholic International Peace and Non-Violence movement. We used to be Pax Christi United Kingdom, as many of you will know, but Pax Christi Scotland quite rightly declared independence in 2019. I've been in post exactly a year this week, and what a year that has been. Someone said to me when I joined, what a time to be appointed Chief Executive of a peace movement. And our feeling is, isn't it, that over the last few years we have seen increasing levels of war, conflict and violence. On New Year's Day I was scrolling happily through the BBC News app, and there were 3 international conflict-related stories on the front page. The first was Vladimir Putin announcing that Russia's war on Ukraine would intensify. The second was Israel saying that its war on Gaza would last at least another year. And then the third was increased tension between the US, South Korea and North Korea after North Korea's president had threatened the use of nuclear weapons. What a start to the year that was, and that was on the day that we marked the World Day of Peace. Then last Sunday morning I was listening to Radio 4 at an interview with Margaret Beckett and Ken Clarke. After discussing the election hopes of their two parties, they were asked how they saw the state of the world at the moment. Both said that they thought the world was in the most dangerous place it has been since the Second World War. I'm always wary of saying anything along the lines of this being the worst time we have ever seen, or there being more violent conflict and war now than ever before. Social media and the speed of communication can mean that we are just more aware of the levels of violence and conflict in the world than previous generations have been. Yesterday, one of my morning readings was from Genesis. Genesis 6:11 describes the world before the flood. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. There really is nothing new under the sun, perhaps. Yet our perception is that levels of violent conflict we are witnessing are unprecedented. And with our Western focus on the Middle East and Russia and Ukraine, there are many conflicts we either ignore or are ignorant of. Sudan, South Sudan, Nigeria, Ethiopia and Eritrea, and the list could go on. Just this week we've seen renewed, I don't want to say interest, but a renewed focus on the war, the conflict in Yemen, and we've seen violence in Ecuador. Certainly Pope Francis has said that what we are witnessing is a third world war by instalments, and he seems to include a call for peace every time he speaks at the moment. Last Monday, speaking to the ambassadors to the Holy See, he focused his reflections on peace, saying, "It is increasingly threatened, weakened, and in part lost." He repeated his assertion that our world is witnessing a growing number of conflicts that are slowly turning what I have often called a third world war fought piecemeal into a global conflict. And then we mustn't forget that there is violence in our own nation and our own local communities. We know that there's said to be, helpfully or unhelpfully, an epidemic of serious youth violence across the UK. There's experience of that here in Liverpool, and I have my own experience of it from working when I worked for Christian International Peace Service in Brixton, South London, before I joined Pax Christi. We see an increasing level of domestic violence, violence towards women and girls. There's violence towards refugees and asylum seekers, both physically and in policy and in the language used to categorise and dehumanise people. The Brexit referendum might seem a while ago now, but it revealed just how polarised we are and have become on a whole range of issues. There's violence in our politics. On New Year's Day, the Archbishop of Canterbury issued a plea to politicians to stop treating each other as enemies, but as fellow human beings instead. That's quite a thing, isn't it, for an Archbishop of Canterbury to have to issue that plea to politicians. How do we live non-violently in this environment? What are the challenges facing us as we head further into 2024? Yes, think for a moment there. First of all, perhaps we should restate the call on us as Christians to live non-violently. Now, I realise I'm speaking to a room full of people to whom that call is obvious and has been obvious for some time, and almost certainly longer than it has been obvious to me. And yet I do think that call needs reaffirming, because perhaps the first challenge that we face living in a violent world is that as we seek to live non-violently, the culture of violence in which we live is so pervasive that a commitment to living non-violently is so countercultural that we risk forgetting that call and its how fundamental it is to our faith. I'll just say that again because I completely messed that sentence up. I do think that call needs reaffirming, because the first challenge we face in seeking to live non-violently in a violent world is that the culture of violence in which we live is so pervasive and the commitment to living non-violently so countercultural that we risk forgetting this call is fundamental to our faith. We are surrounded by what Walter Wink calls the myth of redemptive violence, the belief that violence saves and that wars make peace. Violence is simply the nature of things. It is what works, is what that culture says, or what that myth says. The myth is very obviously played out in the international stage, and we have seen it right now, or we're seeing it right now in the conflict in the Middle East. Hamas cross the border from Gaza into Israel and commit unspeakable acts of brutality and violence because they believe this is the only way to gain freedom for the Palestinian people. I realise that's a gross oversimplification of what they are trying to achieve, but you'll understand the background to that. In turn, the State of Israel responds with overwhelming and disproportionate violence because its leaders say the only way they could defend people against future aggression is to annihilate every member of Hamas. Whilst that happens, Houthis in Yemen decide that one way to stop the violence against the people of Palestine is to attack shipping connected to Israel and supporting nations, leading to the US and the UK saying, we will attack you because you're now attacking our shipping and our interests. I realise I'm not going to win any international relations prizes for that analysis, but you will get the drift. The world's default position is that conflict is resolved and the behaviour and minds of others changed through violence. I've long thought that the policies of one of our political parties in particular all come down to one belief, that if you want people to change the way they act, you need to hit them with a stick, or at least threaten to hit them. And the more fundamental you want the change to be, the bigger the stick you need. It's a belief in a form of violence as a deterrent. The current Rwanda scheme for asylum seekers and refugees is an example, isn't it? The belief that if you threaten desperate people with deportation to Rwanda, they will change their behaviour. It's madness, isn't it? It's the myth of violence. I don't think I'll be winning any prizes for that piece of political analysis either. And don't expect to see me being interviewed by Lorna Koonsberg next Sunday morning. We are a very long way from remembering Martin Luther King's words. He said, "The ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral, begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, it multiplies it. Through violence you may murder the liar, but you cannot murder the lie, nor establish the truth. Through violence you murder the hater, but you do not murder hate. In fact, violence merely increases hate. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. We don't just see the myth of redemptive violence acted out in international relations, it is also endemic in popular culture. We see it in what we perceive as entertainment, in Bond films, the Marvel franchise, Mission Impossible to name but a few. It runs through video games and even, as Walter Wink points out, through cartoons. I can remember after I'd first read Walter Wink's book, The Powers That Be, in which he talks about the myth of redemptive violence, how I suddenly saw so much of what I had been watching and reading in a totally new light. The myth of redemptive violence is everywhere. When we are surrounded by the levels of violence we currently see, and where that myth of redemptive violence dominates thinking, our call to live differently is challenged. But it is there, that call is there. In his message for the World Day of Peace in 2017, Pope Francis took non-violence as his theme. Violence is not the cure for our broken world, he said, going on to quote Pope Benedict XVI, who said, for Christians, non-violence is not merely tactical behaviour, but a person's way of being. The attitude of one who is so convinced of God's love and power that he or she is not afraid to tackle evil with the weapons of love and truth alone. So that's that first challenge. We can forget our call to live non-violently. Second challenge to me is closely related, and that is that we disqualify ourselves. On a few occasions I've been asked to speak on Blessed Are the Peacemakers, and I've started those talks by asking people what comes into their minds when they hear the word peacemaker. I think we can do the same with non-violence and ask who comes into our minds when we think of non-violence. For many of us, I can tell you the group of people it will be. It will be people like Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day. Dorothy Day, not Doris Day. Maybe it is Doris Day, I don't know. What do I know? I'm assuming I know what comes into your minds. But would you agree those are the names that will come to mind? Certainly they're the names that appear in much of the writing on non-violence. The problem for us is that when we move from taking those peoples as the inspiration they undoubtedly are, and which they need to be, we start to believe that it's only the experts or the heroes or those who are made that way or who are qualified to live non-violently, and we discount ourselves from that. Yet, as that quote from Pope Benedict shows, we are all called to pursue a life of non-violence. It is a part of our formation as disciples. The second half of the Beatitude, Blessed are the Peacemakers, is of course, for they shall be called children of God. If we are peacemakers, if we live non-violently, we are children of God. Conversely, if we are children of God, we are peacemakers and live non-violently. It's like a beautiful equation. The mathematicians will love it. If I can slightly misquote Thomas Merton, who was writing of being a peacemaker, he said, "The Christian is and must, by his very adoption as a son of God in Christ, live a non-violent life." So in a violent world, we can lose our sense of call, we disqualify ourselves, and the next challenge is we become discouraged and lose heart. I don't think I need to say too much about this challenge, as I'm sure we will all recognise it. Particularly when it comes to non-violent protest and campaigning, it can feel that we have been working for years, but nothing changes. In fact, we look around and think, not only is nothing changing, but everything is actually getting worse. Are we making any progress? Yesterday, a group of Pax Christi supporters and members down in London joined the Ceasefire Now March for Palestine. We publicised the opportunity to march together as a group and received this email in response from one supporter. "Sorry to be negative, but there is no point. The British betrayed the Arabs and reneged on their promise that they would have their own nation because the British were looking after their own interests. And to me, by the looks of it, the British as well as the Americans will be looking after their own interests yet again. What's the point? Nothing changes. It seems that violence wins. Will the UK government ever change its mind on nuclear weapons? Will any government of any type ever sign the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons? Will that arms fair, wherever it takes place, ever not happen? We can get ground down and we can risk burnout. Albert Einstein famously said, of course, that the definition of insanity is to keep doing the same thing and expecting different results. A challenge in living non-violently in a violent world is not falling into the trap of thinking he might have been right. Dare I challenge Einstein? I think I do. Consistent non-violent living is not somehow bordering on insanity. If you take nothing else away from today, take that away. How do we overcome discouragement and meet that challenge to persevere, even when the forces against us seem overwhelming? I won't say so much on that, because we will all have our strategies and know the things that we find helpful in building up our vision and in encouraging ourselves. Perhaps the first thing is being able to sense when that is happening to us, and to remember that we aren't the first to face discouragement in trying to live a counter-cultural life. Two encouragements, one from Paul and one from the writer of the letter to the Hebrews. 2 Corinthians 4:16. Therefore we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed every day. And Hebrews 12. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. And then there are many stories of where non-violence has worked. We should keep retelling them and inspiring each other with them and finding new ones. I'm partway through reading a biography of Martin Luther King at the moment and being inspired by the Montgomery bus boycott. That worked despite the forces ranged against it. This last Thursday I noticed too, it was the anniversary of the day in 1948 when Gandhi began his last fast in New Delhi, through which he wanted to convince Hindus and Muslims in the city to work towards peace. He ended the fast after 6 days, believing that harmony had been achieved. The note I read on that story said, for most of his adult life, Gandhi read Jesus' Sermon on the Mount every morning, convinced that it contained a truth more powerful than the empire that occupied his native India or the enmity that divided Hindus and Muslims. Now there's an idea. Reading the Sermon on the Mount every day to encourage ourselves. Hold that thought. And before I fall into that very trap I described, you thinking, oh yes, but that was Martin Luther King and Gandhi. I've also been inspired and encouraged over the last year by so many of those I have met who have been working for peace and seeking to work to live non-violently year after year for a long time, and who have kept doing so even in the face of an apparent lack of success. And I've got to pay tribute here to Merseyside Pax Christi Group. I've got to know you over the year, and your commitment and your perseverance is inspiring and encouraging. And C&D are here today, and the same would apply there, wouldn't it? Year after year, keeping going on those campaigns, even though there doesn't seem to be results. Another challenge is that non-violence seems naive. When we advocate non-violence, we risk being seen as naive and idealistic. In fact, we don't just risk it, we are seen as naive and unrealistic. Just think in particular of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. How do we continue to argue for non-violent responses and strategies in the context of a conflict where there is a clear aggressor who is attacking and has invaded a sovereign state by force, where there is no justification at all for that aggression, and everyone acknowledges that a state has a right to defend itself and to use force to do so? How do we keep arguing for non-violence in those circumstances? We've seen that Pope Francis himself was criticised for not affirming this right to self-defence as vigorously as certainly Ukrainian believes he should have done. And if you read tablet editorials, it's quite interesting to read over the last year I think a movement from initially saying almost that Pope Francis was too idealistic and not vigorously defending the right to defend itself enough, to an understanding, perhaps a greater understanding of what he was trying to say. This is a real challenge to us, and it's one that we have to wrestle with. There are no easy answers, and there are tensions that aren't easily resolved. What we are coming up against here is the challenge of just war theory to an ethic of non-violence, and that is a whole subject in itself. Yet if we hold to what Martin Luther King said and believe that violence in response to injustice simply leads to more violence, then however naive and idealistic we might seem, we must continue to argue that violence is circular and has never been and cannot be a path to a sustainable and lasting peace. In an article in our Just Peace newsletter towards the end of 2022, Eli McCarthy set out steps he thought could be taken toward breaking the cycle of violence and ending the war in Ukraine. He also reminded us that in arguing for non-violent approaches, we must understand and respect those who choose violent resistance instead. He said active non-violence is not about condemning or judging people who lean towards violent resistance in really difficult situations like the ones the Ukrainians face. Instead, it affirms and admires their willingness to take a stand against injustice rather than to be passive. Active non-violence is primarily about accompaniment, which is being done in a variety of creative, courageous, non-violent ways by Ukrainians and others. In facing this challenge of seeming naive and idealistic, it's also worth remembering something Gandhi said. He said, "My creed of non-violence is an extremely active force. It has no room for cowardice or even weakness. There is hope for a violent man to be someday non-violent, but there is none for a coward. I have therefore said more than once that if we do not know how to defend ourselves, our women and our places of worship by the force of suffering, i.e. non-violence, we must, if we are men, be at least able to defend all these by fighting." What he's saying there is our non-violence is not passive complicity or submission or cowardice, but it is active and courageous. And that's the answer to the challenge that we are naive and idealistic. So there's a lot of challenges. How do we respond? How do we now lift ourselves to respond to these? How do we respond to any sense that we're losing our calling, we're disqualifying ourselves? And how do we overcome these accusations that we are idealistic? I don't think it would be a surprise if I was to say we should start again with ourselves. And Archbishop Malcolm said the same in the homily this morning. With so much of the increased violence we are witnessing being way beyond our control, way beyond anything we can do about, the only thing we can do is to start with us. There's a famous quote from St. Francis: "While you are proclaiming peace with your lips, be careful to have it even more fully in your own heart." Again, in his message on non-violence for the World Day of Peace in 2017, Pope Francis said, "If violence has its source in the human heart, then it is fundamental that non-violence be practiced before all else within families." What he's saying is, it should start with us, but above all else with us. If we are to meet these challenges to live non-violently, then we start with ourselves and we deal with the violence in our own lives. I've been thinking again recently of what it means to disarm myself, and in the words of Jesus to Peter in the Garden of Gethsemane, to put up my sword in every aspect of life. How does that work out for me? At the time last year when Gary Lineker was being criticised by politicians for his comments on the government's asylum policy, remember he compared their language to that used by the Nazis and upset a few people as he did so. I was reflecting on then even on the violence of the language we use, or the violence of the language that I use, particularly when I'm critical of others. Henry Newen said, "I've seen so many situations in which people were killed first with the word before they were killed with the gun." The real violence usually starts with words. The real violence starts in the way we speak about people, make assumptions about them, and decide they are not like us. one of the reflections I need to continue with in my own life is, how do I speak about people? Where is the violence in my own life? What does disarming myself and being non-violent mean in that context? Every year at the end of September, we mark the Catholic Non-Violence Initiative Days of Action for Non-Violence, which is quite a set of words, isn't it? A part of that fortnight is encouraging people to make or repeat a vow of non-violence. Now, part of me had thought today that I would bring along copies of that vow and suggest that we take time to consider and make that vow again ourselves this afternoon. So I thought I would bring along the vow of non-violence, but I didn't. Instead, I'd like to encourage us, if we are going to meet these challenges to non-violent living and we're to persevere in them, to take time to reflect again ourselves and move towards a renewed commitment to non-violence, or indeed towards being able to make that vow. And to do that and just see where it takes us. I'd like to encourage us to take time to learn and understand again, or even perhaps understand for the first time, what it means to live a life of active non-violence. As Pax Christi, we spent some time last year looking at our spirituality as an organisation. Individually, we could explore our own spirituality of non-violence. And there's no harm in doing that, in borrowing from others. I do it all the time. I don't think I've had an original thought. Henry Newen's spirituality of peacemaking had 3 elements which are summarised by John Deere as: first, a life of prayer and daily meditation on Christ as a peacemaker with intercession for an end to war. Secondly, ongoing non-violent resistance to the forces of violence. Thirdly, being part of communities of active non-violence. And he happened actually to mention Pax Christi groups specifically in that, just to drop that in. That could be somewhere to start as we develop our own spirituality. Even that first component is a challenge, isn't it? Particularly to activists. A life of prayer and daily meditation. We want to be out on the next, well, I think we want to be out on the next protest. We want to be writing the next letter. We don't want to necessarily be sitting still and praying and contemplating. But here's another encouragement from Gandhi on that. Prayer is not an old woman's idle amusement. Properly understood and applied, it is the most potent instrument of action. I've already said if we take nothing else away from today, but I'm going to say it again. If we take nothing else away from today, perhaps we could take that encouragement to root our desire for a non-violent life in deeper prayer and contemplation. I want to finish with another quote from Pope Francis from that message in 2017, which I hope, amidst all the talk of challenges and increased violence and conflict, will envision us again, and I'm risking that evangelical bit again here, send us out to live non-violent lives. He said this: all of us want peace. Many people build it day by day through small gestures and acts. Many of them are suffering, yet patiently persevere in their efforts to be peacemakers. And I'm going to intersperse 2024 here. In 2024, may we dedicate ourselves to banishing violence from our hearts, words and deeds, and to becoming non-violent people, and to building non-violent communities that care for our common home. Nothing is impossible if we turn to God in prayer. Everyone can be an artisan of peace. Nothing is impossible. We can all be non-violent artisans of peace. Thank you.